Hello everyone! Welcome to my independent study on motion control filming. It centers around using a robot to film miniature models against a blue or green screen, and then taking the individual elements and combining them into one shot. This is of course a technique that predates the era of CGI. Looking a little bit into the history of these techniques, one will find first of all that the film miniatures have been used for over a century, as in Georges Méliès's Le Voyage dans la Lune. As for multiple elements in one shot, Monsieur Méliès has still got you covered. Except, of course, when objects have to exist in the same space. Notice how Monsieur Méliès's arm gets a little garbled when he moves it in front of the head? This is because he simply rewound the same strip of film multiple times and refilmed it. Hence there was a double exposure, which also explains why the heads are somewhat transparent. To create more advanced shots, where elements do go behind and in front of each other, there then came the invention of chroma keying, as seen in The Thief of Baghdad in 1940. With physical film, there are various different chroma key processes, all of which are quite complicated, but to quickly oversimplify it, using an optical printer and several intermediate pieces of film, one can ultimately generate these two high-contrast mattes, the background matte and the foreground matte. Combining the original background with the background matte, one gets a background with a sort of hole in it. And with the foreground matte, we can project the foreground element without the blue screen onto the hole in the background, making for the final shot. Nowadays, this process is replaced by digital equivalents. For my project, I used the chroma key feature built into iMovie and Final Cut Pro. It's as simple as pressing a button. With just these tools alone, miniatures and chroma keying, one can already start playing around quite a bit. But that may perhaps be the limit, playing around. You see, so far the camera has been quite static, introducing angular movement, also known as pans, tilts, and rolls. In any case, it has to do with angles. One of the things I find interesting about these angles is that they're actually what determines the location of something on a two-dimensional screen. As you can see from this small experiment, the puppy is moving in combinations of forward, left, and right, but on the two-dimensional screen, it doesn't seem to move around so much. It's interesting to think about, and what it means for movements of multiple blue screen elements is that it doesn't matter how close or far away something is, you just apply the same rotations. Now here in this other little experiment, I tried doing just that with the clamp in my hands, but as you can see, the results are less than pleasing. In order to replicate the same exact motions properly, we use robots. Introducing the Dijkstra Flex, a first-of-its-kind creation made by Industrial Light and Magic in 1977 for the original Star Wars. It could do tilts, pans, and rolls, as well as several translational movements which we will talk about later. For all these movements, what allowed it to replicate them so precisely is that it stored these movements in the memory of a pretty much scratch-built computer and executed them using stepper motors, which are motors that move in specific increments or steps of angles that the computer can track. Then there's a little camera that could, built by me out of Lego. It's controlled by a Mindstorms EV3 programmable brick, which is an easily usable 32-bit Linux-based microcontroller marketed towards middle school kids. Welcome to the 21st century, everyone. Its motors are subtly different in that they have a separate rotation sensor, which technically makes them servo motors, but all that means is that I am able to track the motor's movements, meaning that I too can replicate the same motion multiple times. The little camera that could can only do pans and tilts. In order to get small delicate movements, I originally geared the motors down 1 to 35, but then I later found that a warm gear made for an even better precision, as it resulted in less idler gears, which are gears not directly connected to a motor or an output. In any case though, considering that this is all ABS plastic held together by friction, its precision is inevitably limited. So as you can see, it's not perfect, but it's a lot better than doing it by hand. And if it's any consolation, the original Star Wars had its precision problems too. If you're wondering about the mysterious beep, that helps me to make sure that the motions all start at the same time when I put the elements together in editing. Now for a common mistake. Remember when I said to apply the same camera rotations to each element of a shot? Well, if you don't do that, you get weirdness like these Star Destroyers pulling off extreme drift moves. A perhaps less noticeable mistake, though, is to accidentally use angular movements to move something across a screen. It's entirely possible, but it leads to something that looks like a PowerPoint presentation with two-dimensional images moving around. This is because only true translational movement can give you a natural change in perspective. Notice how canine cannot be replaced by a two-dimensional image here. In truth, I actually have no way of knowing whether or not this mistake is common, but I made it genuinely in my first round of filming, and it took me a while to figure out what went wrong. Anyways, speaking of translational movement, that's the next big step. For the most part, the camera just does what you would like the miniature to do in reverse. Say, for example, you want a Star Destroyer to go right. You make the camera go left. Simple as that, mostly. You see, it is worth noting, though, that unlike with angular movements, the effect of translational movements on-screen two-dimensional movement does depend on how far away things are. To illustrate the effect of distance, here's an intro shot to a stop-motion film I once did. To create the illusion of vast expanses of space, I made 3 layers. The first layer with the road and the fence and the grass I moved at normal speed. The second layer with the small trees I moved at half that speed. And the third layer with the side of a hill or something I moved really slowly. Overall, I'd say it makes intuitive sense that things far away move slowly on a two-dimensional screen, but just in case you're feeling particularly skeptical, I went ahead and did the mathematical proof. If you take the on-screen position to be a function of the angle theta, as we showed with the puppy experiment, then if an object is moving perpendicular to the camera, theta changes more slowly if the object is farther away. The only major consequence this has for us is the stars. For to use the words of John Dijkstra, the special effects supervisor of Star Wars, quote, "No track moves are necessary on the stars, as they are at an infinite distance and traveling toward them or away from them will not noticeably change their position in frame." What I find particularly perplexing about Dijkstra's statement, however, is that the stars in Star Wars do in fact seem to whiz around, so as to suggest that the ships are swirling around in a merry-go-round-like fashion, pulling off even extremer drift moves. I suppose one must remember that the original Star Wars, not unlike my project, was a bit of a rushed job. Anyways, as for the ships, which are not at an infinite distance away, there is no need to create illusions like I did in my stop-motion film, when you can just move them farther away from the camera. With the blaring exception, of course, of when we have ships of different scales. For my film, there is a huge range of scales, so it is critical that there aren't any marks on them that could indicate their true size. Wait. Well, that aside, with respect to the little camera that could and its movements, we need to scale them appropriately. In order to do this, I drew out a master plan for each shot. Here for shot 2, I recorded the initial angular position of the camera, as well as a little map as calculated in meters in the fictional Star Wars universe. Pay good attention to the fact that in this map, there is a camera reference point. To turn this into reality, I convert out of Star Wars universe meters into real-life centimeters, and this results in different distances for differently scaled models. The same exact thing applies to how far the camera moves. Now let's see it in action. Here's Red 4 approaching the camera at 3.7 meters per second. And here's the Blockade Runner approaching the camera at 3.7 meters per second. Add in the stars and the other ships, and you have what I consider to be the best shot I produced for the entire project. Reflecting back on the robots, the little camera that could had some problems. You see, I ordered these gear racks to make the track you see here, but they came in so incredibly late that I had to resort to using wheels, which of course made for an incredibly imprecise and bumpy ride. Thankfully Final Cut Pro had some camera stabilization features. Also, even with the track, it wasn't perfect, and on top of that, it's only one axis of movement. Now as for the Dijkstra Flex, it too had precision track movements, and it also had this crane-like arm, which could go up and down and rotate around. Now while I can see why one might choose this design for its transportability, if I were to redesign it, I would make the other 2 axes of translational movement just like the first one, a track that the camera can move along. This would result in something a lot like this 3-axis industrial robot I just found on the internet. The reason for that change is that, as I found with working with one axis, when the axes are linear like that, it's easy to adjust the scale of the movements to different models, or to add various vectors and go along the resultant. You can essentially go anywhere within a certain boundary box. But with the crane, when you move it up and down, for instance, you create unintentional movement in other axes, and the same is true of rotating it around. It's simply how circles work. Well, I think that just about concludes this project on motion control filming. If you had any questions about how I did voice modulation, or the stop motion, or the coordination of the music, or even the programming of the Mindstorm ZV3, I'd be happy to talk to you. Yeah, I think that's just about it.